We are joined now by Tim Verghese from Inside Nebraska. Tim, how are you this morning?
Not too bad, not too bad. Getting out of June, kind of ready for vacation at this point.
Well, yeah, a little bit of a dead period means that you get a chance to exhale a little bit, man. I'm sure your board has to be going bananas with the ebbs and flows of trying to follow all these intended targets.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, especially right now, just kind of coming out of the month that was, some of these guys. I think a lot of people don't really understand is, they expect like, hey, where's this guy leaning now that June's over? It's like, hey, these recruitments aren't done. These guys go home and then they sit down and they think about it for a couple of days, and you know, and where all these schools are now with some of these guys, it's a tough decision, like, I mean, as much as Nebraska has to offer at the same time, these guys are getting pushed and pulled all the kind of different directions. They have, playing time opportunities, NIL opportunities elsewhere. It's just a tough thing to kind of balance for these guys right now. And so, I mean, you saw it just last night. I mean, Brian Tapu committing to Oregon State on Sunday, and then Wednesday night decommitting, and then reached out to him kind of to figure out why. And he was like, I came home, sat down with my family, thought about it, and I feel like I made a rash decision. I needed to sit down and think about where my heart really was. And then he ended up, committing to Nebraska late last night. So that's just kind of where these guys are at.
Tim, it's interesting you brought that up because we talked yesterday on the show about how I felt like when people make commitments on their visit, a lot of times it is more of an emotional decision. And I feel like when they make a decision, 24 or 48 hours afterward, I feel a lot better about kind of their reasoning behind it. That's totally just an arbitrary thing that I kind of have in my head, but it seems like that is what played out with Tapu.
Yeah, pretty much. It was there's some family ties at Oregon State. I think just he kind of got swept up in the moment of that visit, that family, like kind of just like spending that time with them. And like it is, I think Oregon State kind of pitched the, hey, we're somewhat closer to home than Lincoln is, but at the same time, when you're flying from Auckland, New Zealand, what's another 3-4 hours,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, that's how it played out there. It was kind of just that, like, yeah. But I totally agree. I think those on campus commitments I don't always love. Like even coming out of this past weekend, Nebraska got one or two that committed on the spot, but haven't really announced it because they're going to take some time, and that's one of those things that I prefer. That if you're going to commit, like, give it some time for you to go home, think about it, sit down with your parents, and then make that decision.
Tim, is that a Nebraska thing where they ask them to take a couple days before they announce it so that they are sure, or is that a prospect thing?
It's a mix of both. I know Nebraska's not really pressuring guys to commit necessarily, but and at the same time, they'll accept a commitment, but they'll make sure the guys do their due diligence. Like, hey, go home, think about it, make sure you know what you're doing and what you're thinking here. I think you've noticed, like, I don't think Nebraska gets a whole lot of these immediate commitments coming out of the weekend. It's usually, like you said, like a day or two removed, and I think that's intentional.
Some of it absolutely is. Now that I'm listening to you guys kind of volleyball this thing back and forth, because I was telling a couple stories, about Coach Rhule wanting players to find a home, and he'll start out by telling guys, hey, explore all options. Do what you need to. If I were you, these are the questions I would ask. And so he's like empowering the folks that he's recruiting to be comfortable in doing their due diligence. Not only, in my opinion, is it a win-win because it shows that he's secure, but I think it's why so many of these recruits, Tim, and you could speak better this than I do because you talk to them post-visit more, but it's why they feel hey, he really cares about me. Like, I feel like there's this real relational thing that's actually going on because he's not trying to rush us.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something you hear from everyone. Not just the fact that they're like, Rhule doesn't try to rush us. I'm like, hey, what was Nebraska's like pitch to you? The final sit down with Coach Rhule, what was that like? And they're like, Rhule didn't try to pitch me. Like, and that's pretty much everybody's like, Rhule didn't try to pitch me. He just sits in there, kind of tells me about the program he's building, and then kind of says, hey, we want you to make the best option for you and your family. We just want you to be able to find a good spot for you. Like, what are you looking for? What are the needs you're trying to address? And then, like, kind of goes through the recruiting process with them from an objective point of view, which really leaves a mark on these guys. Because again, like you said, shows them how secure he is, but at the same time, it also shows them that like, hey, he truly cares about me, the individual, not me, the football player.
We're talking with Tim Verghese from inside Nebraska. So let's talk about Tapu specifically a little bit here and kind of what Donnie's been doing in building that O-line room, because this is a guy who's 6'7", just under 300 pounds, hasn't been playing football that long. He, to me, is a super interesting prospect because of what I would imagine to be a pretty high upside considering his frame and lack of experience.
Yeah, this is I put it in my analysis piece last night. Like, don't count on Tapu cracking the rotation his first 2 years on campus. You know, he's a guy that has 1 year of football experience under his belt, and like truly just 1 year. Like, he coming from New Zealand, he wasn't really interested. He just visited the country, saw the game being played with his cousins, like kind of participated, and then kind of made that move and decided to commit to that sport his junior year. So he's not even like touched or learned the technique or anything until this last year. So this is a guy that's going to need some time. You watch his film, there's good stuff in the run blocking aspect of it, and he holds his own in pass, in pass pro, but he needs a lot of work in pass pro. But he's got the ability, like you watch him move for six, as big as he is, he moves extremely fluid down the field, gets good knee bend. You watch him, he gets pretty good, like good consistent leverage, which is surprising for a guy with his experience and his size. That's something a lot of bigger guys usually struggle with, but he doesn't really have that issue right now. Has good power, good punch. So there's a lot of play to work with, and I think that's what has Nebraska so intrigued here. But Nebraska understands it. He understands as well. Kind of, I asked him, like, what's the role Nebraska's talked about you playing? And he's like, yeah, Rhule and Raiola just truly see me as a developmental guy. I understand that, given my experience, that I'm going to have to come in and kind of earn my spot. And Raiola wants to play the best players available. I want to train until I am in that position.
Does he kind of make perfect sense for them as a prospect, considering his timeline and considering the fact that you're looking at, 18 sophomores, freshmen, redshirt freshmen in the offensive line room? Like, somebody on that extended timeline actually is sort of perfect for them, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I've kind of maintained through this cycle that I don't think Nebraska's taking a super big O-line class. Like, I know people kind of worry about some of these guys.
I agree, man. I agree.
And some of these guys dropping off the board, and you look at it, and it's like, what have they prioritized this cycle? They haven't really prioritized. They've taken some big swings at offensive tackle with David Sanders and Douglas Utu, and they've at least getting those guys on campus. And then you look at what else they've prioritized. They've really prioritized the interior of the line. They've got Houston Quijano Torres. He's announcing a decision on Sunday. Nebraska hopes that goes their direction, but I don't think that one's done just yet. But that's a priority center target and a guy that, if you talk O-line, probably the number one priority. They want to address that center spot when Ben Scott's gone. Houston kind of comes from that long line of interior linemen from Hawaii that are smart, physical, intuitive, like understand the game. Like, they see him as the center of the future. And then you look at the other two guys they've really prioritized. It's S.J. Alufetuli and Ale Kalani Uvalu both from Bishop Gorman. Both of those guys, interior linemen in their own right. S.J. is the center, and I think it's just who gets the spot first. Is it S.J. is the Houston? And then Ale's Mormon. He's going on a mission, so he's not going to be enrolled until 2027. So again, another like long-term down the line guy. I think they take maybe 2-3 more offensive linemen and call it a day in this cycle.
It's interesting because I love that perspective. We were trying to make the case yesterday where I get it with quarterbacks and some other positions where when we look at depth chart, we always talk about whether that would scare a guy away. Well, Dylan could be a 3-year starter, or when they pencil him in, or, what's Latif think? And we talk about that like quarterbacks. And it was saying yesterday, those were the numbers we used, was 17 or 18 true underclassmen. Maybe we need to reconsider how we look at offensive line play too, because Nebraska has quietly stacked considerable depth. And I wanted to remind people yesterday and the day before in talking about Tapu that I think we forgot about the spring game last year and what a concerted effort they wanted to make it look like real football without a lot of offensive line in play. They have rebuilt this thing seemingly overnight for people to feel like the sky was falling over Tapu.
Oh yeah. And yeah, I mean, like, yeah, you think about the spring game last year and the spring game this year. I mean, like, I remember them going to spring practices and like Dylan's working with the third string O line, and they're holding up fine. Like that wasn't a thing a year ago. There wasn't a third string line last year.
Yeah, that's a fair point. There just wasn't even a third string line, and this year you could have three strings of line just in the underclassmen alone, which is, like DB said, really quietly rebuilt this thing on the fly, and that's super impressive to me because a lot of times O line takes a super long time to build and figure out.
Tim, let me ask you something, because I think this is this your third or fourth school?
This is my third school.
Okay. So you ever seen a personality type like Donnie publicly that seems to be in such stark contrast privately when he's recruiting? I've watched him up close the last year or so. He's completely different in terms of his level of engagement when he's not behind the podium.
Yeah.
Do you have you have a couple guys like that?
There's a couple. I mean, I think one that comes to mind is just like hearing the way recruits talk about Jim Harbaugh compared to, you know, the way he kind of the public perceives him. He's still that goofy out there guy. I mean, that he's always been that goofy out there guy, but recruits are like, man, he really resonates. He knows how to connect with the youth. Like he really gets us sometimes. And I'm like, really? That's interesting. I think Sharon Moore's a similar way. Sharon,
that's a good one. That's a good one.
He's good, man. He's a real good recruiter, and I think you're starting to see that kind of like the difference between him and Harbaugh kind of start to come to light. And now that he's taken over that program, the way they're recruiting now, they're recruiting at a much higher level than they were under Harbaugh. They did a good job with Harbaugh of identifying, developing talent, but now they're like really in on some of these big boy recruitments. And they're finding ways to win, which wasn't a thing under Harbaugh.
Tim, I'm curious because you mentioned some of the high profile offensive linemen that were brought in, the big swings that Nebraska was taking, and I know people get frustrated because those end up being very public misses, right? But whether it's like Sanders or like Shull down at Auburn, Utu, like isn't it part of the process to get into the conversation with these guys and get them on campus? Like, it's frustrating not to land them, but Nebraska hadn't even been getting these guys on campus before. Like, that's a step in the right direction in this process, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is absolutely a step in the right direction. And I've kind of maintained too these last 2 weeks, kind of with some of these misses, like, hey guys, like, be patient, because I think the fall, like, the staff wants to get most of this class figured out before the fall. Like, ideally, they would like to have that done. But the staff also recognizes that for a lot of these guys, they just want to see results. In their lifetime, they haven't seen Nebraska win football games, like win consistently. So they want to see results. They want to see, hey, Nebraska's shown me all of these different things. I just need to see results. When those results come, you're going to see some guys that are maybe committed elsewhere, maybe aren't really considering Nebraska anymore, kind of start to pop back up on the radar, potentially, make their way back to campus, be intrigued, and potentially, flipping from their current school. I think the fact that they're getting, I mean, for us at Rivals, we have David Sanders as the number 1 offensive tackle and Douglas Utu the number 2 offensive tackle. The fact that Nebraska had both those guys on campus this last 2 months is insane. That, like, it just wasn't a thing for a long, long time. And the fact that both are in there, both have good relationships at Nebraska, that if something does go wrong down the line, Nebraska is one of those schools that could potentially be like, hey, come flip back to us, or hey, you're in the portal, come portal over to us. Like, Nebraska's done that and built those relationships where they're in that conversation for the next couple of years.
Hey, I want to take a little bit of a deep dive because I want to reward you for your homework. There's 2 guys, and I want to start with Hawthorne out of Gilbert. And I think the consensus is it's Iowa State or Nebraska. When you're looking at kind of his profile, and I'll get to Sard next. I'll get to Donovan Sard next out of Brentwood. But when you're talking about guys like Hawthorne, when you talk to him, does he see guys that he thinks that he could be like? Because That's a kind of a little closet thing I think Nebraska's very good at. They're very good with on the fly comps when they're rolling tape and watching tape with guys. Who's a comp do you think for Hawthorne?
Ooh, I don't know if there's one necessarily that the staff's told him. I'll say like watching his film, I see a lot of Reimer there, like a lot of Luke Reimer there, like just
Yeah.
similar traits, similar like, hey, there's this raw athlete that plays with his hair on fire, and just loves to hit people and plays that old school enforcing linebacker style.
He is
Like kind of
very good with diagonals like that, where
yeah.
he can close at angles.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And he takes good angles too. Like I kind of noted it yesterday. Like he doesn't really overrun guys, which sometimes you see, like especially guys that love to take those angles and just like fly around. They just sometimes overcommit, but he does a really good job of as he's getting to that spot, slowly but surely squaring up, making sure he's not getting beat on either side. Yeah, like Reimer is a good comp for him, in my opinion, just watching him. I'll say coming out of this weekend, a comp that I did hear the staff make. They showed Bryson Weber, the 6'3" corner out of Houston. They showed Bryson a lot of Tommy Hill tape, and they were like, Tommy was in the same position as you. Like he didn't really see it in himself, like switching from wide receiver to corner, or didn't really see like the upside he has as a DB. And then we kind of instilled some of this IQ in him and trained some of this IQ into him. And we can do the same thing for you. And, I've been around Bryson, I've seen the player, and like I get what kind of Cooper sees there. I think Weber's a lot more raw than Hill was coming out of high school. Hill did have some a couple of years of corner experience in addition to wide receiver experience. Bryson's going to have a year and a half ish of DB experience when he finally graduates. And so there's a little bit of difference there. But the fact that Nebraska's in that recruitment with Utah and TCU, two programs that have a good tradition of producing DBs. One thing I always say, personally, if Utah offers a DB and is interested in a DB, I'm paying attention to that guy because Utah knows
100%.
defensive back play.
100%. Let's get to Donovan Starr, because a lot of people do the opposite of what Nebraska did. A lot of times Nebraska offers, and then other guys do. This Donovan Starr says yes to Auburn, and Nebraska still offers. Right? You don't. That's not. It typically hasn't been a Nebraska thing. How are you tracking with Donovan Starr?
Yeah, there's a couple of those DB recruitments this cycle where they've kind of entered at interesting times. This one, and then the other one was the DB out of California, LaRue Zamorano.
Yep.
He announced like a top 6, and then a week later, Nebraska offered. Like, Nebraska just and some of those top 6 schools, like when they had offered, it's like, hey, some of these schools have been in here for years, and Nebraska just kind of entered the picture. So Nebraska kind of taking some shots there. Just kind of that's a position right now they kind of need to add some more names to the board. With Starr, that's one that he, like, when I reached out to him, I was just like, hey, I know you just committed to Auburn, but Nebraska offered. What's your kind of read? And he's like, I'm interested. I'm going to have some conversations with them this summer. And then, but right now, I'm locked in with Auburn. So I think he's going to let this commitment kind of sit for a bit, but I wouldn't be surprised because Nebraska's not the only school pushing there. Wouldn't be surprised come the fall, he starts to explore some other options and just make sure he made the right decision, considering some schools that have entered the Bigs this summer and some of the schools that have continued to push despite his commitment. So wouldn't say this one's done necessarily, but at the same time, it's a bit of a long shot all the time when you offer a kid that's committed elsewhere, especially one from the South.
Tim, talk to me about Jeremiah Jones. I know he was on an official visit to Nebraska, and he's expected to make his decision on Monday. Where does Nebraska sit with him?
I feel good about where Nebraska stands coming out of the weekend. I think they did a really good job kind of making that first impression or making that this was the first impression for them, but making that lasting impression on him, kind of showing him they care and showing him that, hey, we don't want you just at any one position. We just want you, the player. Like, we're going to figure it out with you. We're just really fascinated with your athletic profile, and we want you on campus. We want to work with you. We want to develop you. We see a lot of different potential paths for you to be successful here. And that's really resonated with him and his family. I think the one factor, I think, decisions coming soon. Right now, I'm going to say it's Nebraska, but I think one thing to be a little wary of is Louisville's NIL. Kind of they're active there, and more so than Nebraska is with some of these high school guys. And if they're willing to pony up here and keep this guy in state, I think they can throw a number down that Nebraska might not be willing to match at this point. At the same time, though, just based on everything I've gathered, this isn't necessarily an NIL recruitment. And the thing is like there's a lot of these recruitments that aren't necessarily NIL recruitments, but it does get to a point where a school offers an amount of money that you just cannot turn down. There's already been a couple Nebraska's been on the other side of, unfortunately, the cycle. There's nothing you can do about that. Like a kid can say all he wants. Hey, I'm not an NIL guy. I know my value. I know it's going to be relatively even wherever I go. But then the school offers something that he didn't expect. I'm not going to fault the kid for saying yes to that number. I mean, like I would do the same thing, but in this situation specifically, I don't think this is going to be an NIL recruitment. I think an interesting note here is like he could play multiple different positions. I kind of see him as a safety linebacker hybrid best at the next level. But this is a kid that, he plays quarterback, he plays wide receiver, he does some running back, he plays linebacker, safety, does some corner at his high school. Like he does it all, there's only a few things he just cannot do on the football field.
Would you pencil in Cortez Mills to Oklahoma?
I would right now. I would keep an eye on LSU there because LSU got him on a surprise visit kind of late in June. And Cortez Hankton, I don't like counting him out of recruitments ever. He's really good at what he does. And if LSU's got Bryce Underwood in their bag, if Bryce Underwood wants a guy, he's done a real good job of getting those guys in the boat. So I'd keep an eye on LSU, but right now I would pencil it in for I think Oklahoma gets him right now.
Tim, any under the radar guys that you're either Nebraska's made an offer on or guys that you're keeping an eye on that intrigue you for Nebraska?
Ooh, there's a couple, but I kind of like looking ahead to kind of 26 and 27. I think that's where we're at this point. In terms of 25, I'm trying to think off the top if there's any under the radar guys. I know there's a couple like wide receivers I'd like to see them offer just based on where that board is right now and kind of where they've got. I mean, Emmanuel Choice is committed to Oklahoma. Cortez Mills is turning to Oklahoma. Michael Terry's still a wide open recruitment, which like the latest I've heard is, hey,
he's interesting, man. He's all over the place.
So fascinating. And I'll give you some context there, just kind of why that's so interesting is he's a freak athlete. You watch the film and you're like, how is this guy not more pursued? Like he finally got the recruiting attention he deserved these last few months, but the kid just didn't have social media until like a year or two ago, or didn't have a phone. Like his parents didn't give him a phone until like a year or two ago. And you can tell by the way he posts and the way he uses social media, this is a guy that's not experienced with it at all. Like he's a guy that like, he'll just post hashtag Go Big Red and then just tag every single coach he possibly can. Like there's no caption, there's no anything. And then he'll tweet out the video that Nebraska gave him, and then he'll tweet out his huddle video next to it because he's still trying to get that exposure from because he was told at a young age, hey, make sure your huddle video is getting out there. It's like, dude, you're down to 4 schools. You don't need to put the huddle video out there anymore. Like you're good. But you can see kind of he's so new to all of this in the way he's handling this process. Like, and that's what makes this recruitment so interesting is every visit he goes on, it's like a brand new experience for him. And he's like, wow, I love that school. Wow, I love that school. And I get it. This is all new for you. This is all when schools are rolling out the red carpet the way they are for him, it's going to blow your mind a little bit. And so the one thing I have heard is Nebraska's kind of done a good enough job that of these 4 schools, they're the ones that can kind of last till the end because they've pitched them right on the football front. Whereas like a school like Texas, which was a school he grew up rooting for, Texas is all kind of, hey, we don't want you at wide receiver, we want you at DB, and he's not super interested in that. And so, but he's still interested in Texas because Texas is Texas. That's the school he grew up rooting for. It's a school close to home, all of that. A&M has done a similar job, but growing up a Texas fan, I think there's some complicated feelings towards A&M. And Oregon's done a good job, but Oregon kind of sees them as like a running back receiver, and they are somewhat newer to this recruitment. I think the fact that Nebraska was as early as they were here and the relationships they've built, they've got lasting power, staying power, and I think ultimately it could end with them winning this in the end, but this remains just like a 4-horse race that I can't call at this point because all of these four are putting their best foot forward. Like, he took 2 visits to Oregon last month, and Oregon rolled out the red carpet. And when Dan Lanning wants a guy, it's hard to beat him right now. He's real good on the trail.
Tim, we appreciate the time. We'll talk to you again next week. Good stuff.
Fantastic, Tim.